A cold front moving across the Midwest isn't the only thing disturbing the status quo tonight. Mark Carney just delivered what can only be described as a masterclass in economic strategy. And Donald Trump's team is scrambling. I'm talking full panic mode in Mar-a-Lago right now. And here's the kicker. Warren Buffett, of all people, just went on record saying the United States is learning what he called an expensive lesson about underestimating Canada. Let me set the stage for you. For months now, Trump has been threatening Canada with tariffs, 25% on all Canadian goods. He's been posting about it, ranting about it at rallies, calling Canada a trade cheater, claiming they're exploiting American workers, the usual playbook. And his advisors, they've been telling him that Canada will fold, that Carney will come crawling to negotiate, that Canada needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Canada. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. Here's what Mark Carney did, and this is brilliant. Instead of responding with matching tariffs, instead of playing Trump's game, Carney went around him entirely. He spent the last 3 months quietly, and I mean quietly, negotiating direct trade arrangements with the European Union, with Japan, with South Korea, with Mexico, believe it or not. And here's the big one, with China. Trump's people saw some of this happening, but they didn't think it would amount to anything. They thought these were just symbolic moves, bargaining chips for when Canada inevitably came back to the negotiating table. But Carney wasn't posturing. He was building an alternative trade architecture that could actually function without U.S. dependency. And 3 days ago, it all went live simultaneously. Canada announced comprehensive trade agreements that effectively reduce their economic reliance on the United States by an estimated 40% over the next 2 years. 40%. Let me say that again, because the magnitude of this cannot be overstated. A 40% reduction in trade dependency on the United States. Canadian lumber, which American construction companies desperately need, is now being redirected to Asian markets at higher prices than what U.S. companies were paying. Canadian pharmaceutical exports, a massive industry, now have preferential access to EU markets. Canadian energy, this is the big one. Canadian energy is being rerouted through new pipeline agreements with overseas buyers. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but how does this actually hurt the United States? Let me tell you exactly how. And this is where Warren Buffett comes in. Buffett gave an interview yesterday. It didn't make huge headlines in the American press because, frankly, the American media doesn't want to highlight this, but Canadian media is all over it. He said, and I'm quoting here, "When you have a trade relationship that's worked for 75 years and you decide to blow it up based on impulse and incomplete information, the market teaches you lessons, expensive lessons. We're seeing that now." He went on to explain that American companies, particularly in manufacturing, construction, and automotive sectors, are now facing supply chain disruptions that are costing them billions, not millions, billions with a B, because they built their entire operations around the assumption that Canadian resources would always be available at competitive prices. Guess what? They're not anymore. Canadian suppliers are honoring existing contracts. Sure, but they're not renewing them. They're not offering new contracts. They're taking their business elsewhere because Carney gave them the infrastructure to do exactly that. Let me give you some numbers because this is where it gets really concrete. The U.S. construction industry is projecting a 17% increase in material costs over the next fiscal quarter. 17%. That's not inflation. That's specifically due to Canadian lumber either being unavailable or substantially more expensive because it's being redirected to other markets. American automotive manufacturers, we're talking about the big three, are facing part shortages for the first time in modern history because Canadian auto parts suppliers are shifting production to serve European and Asian contracts that Carney's government helped broker. These are contracts with better terms, longer durations, and more stability than what Trump's America was offering. The pharmaceutical sector. This one's painful for the U.S. Canada produces a significant percentage of generic medications that Americans rely on. Those medications are now prioritized for Canadian domestic use and for export to EU countries under the new trade framework. American pharmacies are already reporting supply constraints on 17 different generic drugs. And energy. Let's talk about energy for a moment, because this is where Trump really miscalculated. He thought American energy independence meant the U.S. didn't need Canadian oil and natural gas. But here's the reality. The infrastructure is built around Canadian imports, particularly in the northern states. You can't just flip a switch and redirect energy flow. It doesn't work that way. Michigan and Minnesota are facing energy cost increases that are already hitting consumers. Home heating costs are up 22% month over month. 22%. And it's only going to get worse as winter continues because Canadian suppliers have long-term contracts now with European and Asian buyers, and they're fulfilling those contracts first. Governors in both states have publicly criticized Trump's trade policy. These aren't Democratic governors making partisan attacks. These are leaders dealing with real economic pain in their states because of decisions made in Washington without consulting anyone who actually understands how integrated the U.S.-Canada supply chain really is. And Mark Carney, to his credit, he's not gloating. He's not doing victory laps. He's just calmly implementing the strategy he designed. He gave a press conference 2 days ago, very measured, very professional, and he essentially said, Canada remains open to fair trade relationships with all partners, including the United States, but we will not negotiate from a position of manufactured crisis. We've built economic resilience and we're prepared to maintain our course. That last line, we're prepared to maintain our course, that's diplomatic speak for we don't need you anymore, and Trump knows it. His response has been predictably chaotic. First, he tried to downplay it, tweeted that Canada's making a huge mistake and that they'll come crawling back, but his own economic advisors are telling him that's not going to happen. Then he tried to threaten additional tariffs, but his trade team explained that additional tariffs would only hurt American consumers more because Canadian goods that are still coming to the U.S. would simply get more expensive. Then, and this is where it gets really telling, Trump tried to call Carney directly, wanted to have a one-on-one conversation, presumably to try to cut some kind of deal. Carney's office released a statement saying the Prime Minister's schedule didn't permit a call at that time, but the diplomatic channels remain open for formal negotiations. That's a brush-off. That's a polite diplomatic brush-off, and everyone in international trade circles recognized it as such. Now here's where the Buffett comment becomes really significant. Buffett isn't just some random billionaire with an opinion. He's one of the most respected voices in American business. When Warren Buffett says the U.S. is learning an expensive lesson, CEOs pay attention, investors pay attention, and they're acting on it. American companies that are heavily reliant on Canadian imports, their stock prices have taken hits. We're seeing portfolio rebalancing away from sectors that are exposed to this trade disruption, and investment is starting to flow toward Canadian companies that are positioned to benefit from these new trade relationships. There's a brain drain starting too. Highly skilled workers in tech, engineering, finance. They're looking at Canada's stability versus America's trade chaos, and they're making decisions. Vancouver and Toronto are seeing increased interest from American tech workers who want to be in a market that isn't being disrupted by impulsive policy decisions. Let's talk about what this means politically, because this is about more than just trade numbers and economic statistics. This is about power dynamics, about credibility, about how the United States is perceived on the world stage. For 75 years, the United States has been able to essentially dictate terms in North American trade because of the assumption that Canada and Mexico had no alternative. They needed access to American markets more than America needed them. That assumption is being shattered in real time. Other countries are watching this. They're watching Mark Carney build a successful trade framework that reduces dependency on the United States, and they're taking notes. If Canada can do this, if Canada can actually create economic resilience against American pressure, what's stopping other countries from doing the same? The European Union is already in talks with Canada about expanding their new agreements. Japan has indicated interest in deepening their relationship with Canada. Even countries in South America that have traditionally been in the U.S. sphere of influence are looking at the Canada model and thinking, maybe we don't have to accept whatever terms Washington offers. This is a fundamental shift in global trade architecture, and it's happening because Trump's team fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Mark Carney isn't some political novice. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada, then the governor of the Bank of England. He understands global finance at a level that, frankly, few people in Trump's administration can match. He saw Trump's tariff threats coming from miles away, and instead of reacting emotionally or politically, he built a systematic response that would actually work. He built redundancy into Canada's trade relationships. He diversified their economic partnerships. He created leverage. And now, when Trump threatens tariffs, Carney can essentially say, "Go ahead, you'll hurt your own economy more than ours." And the numbers back that up. The economic modeling shows that Trump's threatened tariffs would increase costs for American consumers and businesses by an estimated $140 billion annually. Canada's new trade framework mitigates most of their potential losses. The political fallout in the United States is just beginning. Border states, states whose economies are deeply integrated with Canada, are furious. Business leaders in these states are demanding that Congress intervene, that they put constraints on the president's ability to unilaterally impose trade restrictions that are this economically damaging. There's bipartisan legislation being drafted right now that would require congressional approval for any tariffs over a certain threshold. It probably won't pass. Trump still has enough support to block it. But the fact that it's even being seriously discussed shows how much panic there is in the business community. Agricultural interests are particularly upset because Canada is also a major market for American agricultural exports. Carney hasn't officially retaliated with agricultural tariffs yet, but everyone knows it's on the table. American farmers are already operating on thin margins, and losing Canadian market access would be devastating for many of them. Let me bring this down to a personal level because trade policy can sound abstract, but it has real effects on real people's lives. If you're an American consumer, you're going to see higher prices. Construction costs are going up, which means housing costs rise. Automotive costs are increasing, which means cars get more expensive. Prescription drugs are becoming harder to access, which is literally a life and death issue for people who depend on those medications. If you're a worker in industries tied to Canadian trade, your job security just got a lot more uncertain. Companies are going to be looking at restructuring, at cost cutting, at potentially moving operations to places where they can access the resources they need at competitive prices. If you're a Canadian, on the other hand, you're watching your government successfully stand up to pressure from a much larger neighbor. You're seeing your economy diversify and strengthen. You're seeing the respect that Canada gets internationally increase because they're demonstrating strategic competence. And this is the part that should worry Americans the most. This isn't just about trade with Canada. This is about American credibility broadly. When the United States makes threats it can't back up, when it implements policies that backfire, when it gets outmaneuvered by a country with 1/10 its population, that sends a message to every other country in the world. China is watching this. Russia is watching this. The EU is watching this. And what they're seeing is that American economic dominance isn't as unassailable as everyone thought. They're seeing that smart policy and strategic planning can create real alternatives to U.S.-centric trade relationships. This has implications for everything from climate policy to defense agreements to technology standards, because if countries don't feel economically dependent on the United States, they're less likely to defer to American preferences in other areas. So what happens next? Mark Carney has been very clear that Canada isn't trying to punish the United States. He's been clear that he wants a constructive trade relationship, but he's also been clear that it needs to be a relationship between equals, not a relationship where the United States can impose its will through threats. The ball is in Trump's court now, and he has limited options. He can continue with his tariff threats, but that increasingly looks like it would hurt America more than Canada. He can try to negotiate, but he'd have to come to the table acknowledging that his leverage isn't what he thought it was. or he can do nothing and watch as U.S.-Canada trade relations continue to deteriorate to both countries' detriment, but especially America's. What we're seeing from Trump so far suggests he doesn't really have a coherent strategy. He's bouncing between bluster and backtracking. His team is divided between hardliners who want to escalate and pragmatists who understand they're in a losing position. Meanwhile, Carney is playing chess while Trump is playing checkers. Every move Carney has made has been calculated, has been part of a broader strategy, has been designed to maximize Canada's position. Coming back to Warren Buffett's comment, because I think this is really important, when he talks about expensive lessons, he's not just talking about the direct economic costs. He's talking about the opportunity costs. He's talking about the damage to relationships that took decades to build. He's talking about the loss of trust that happens when you're an unreliable partner. American credibility in trade negotiations is damaged. When the United States negotiates with other countries now, those countries are going to remember what happened with Canada. They're going to build in protections against American unpredictability. They're going to be less willing to make their economies dependent on U.S. markets. Buffett understands that trust is an economic asset. Reliability is an economic asset. Predictability is an economic asset. And Trump's approach to trade has squandered those assets in pursuit of short-term political messaging that doesn't even hold up to economic scrutiny. And it's not just Buffett. Talk to any serious trade economist and they'll tell you the same thing. Trump's Canada policy has been a disaster. It was based on faulty assumptions about leverage, about dependency, about what Canada would be willing to accept. The experts predicted this would happen. They warned that threatening a close ally and integrated trade partner would backfire. They explained that you can't just bully your way to better trade terms when the other side has alternatives. But the Trump administration didn't listen because listening to experts isn't really their strong suit. And now we're all dealing with the consequences. American businesses are dealing with the consequences. American workers are dealing with the consequences. American consumers are dealing with the consequences. Meanwhile, Canada's international standing has never been higher. They're being held up as an example of how a mid-sized economy can maintain sovereignty and independence even when pressured by a much larger neighbor. They're being invited into trade discussions and diplomatic forums with a level of respect that reflects their demonstrated competence. Mark Carney personally is being talked about as one of the most effective economic strategists on the world stage right now. There are already rumors that international organizations are trying to recruit him for major positions because of how well he's handled this situation. Compare that to the Trump administration's trade team, which is increasingly seen as inexperienced and in over their heads. Over there, if you're an American watching this, you should be demanding better from your government. You should be demanding trade policy that's based on actual economic analysis, not on political posturing. You should be demanding leaders who understand that international relationships are complex and that you can't just threaten and bully your way to prosperity. You should be asking why Canada, with a tenth of America's population, was able to out-strategize the United States so completely. You should be asking why Warren Buffett feels the need to publicly warn that America is learning expensive lessons. You should be demanding accountability for policies that are making Americans poorer and less secure. But here's a question I want to put to you directly tonight. Given everything we've just laid out, do you believe this represents a permanent realignment of global trade, where countries will now actively seek alternatives to U.S. markets? Or is this just a temporary disruption that will correct itself once a new administration takes office in Washington? I want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get a real conversation started about where you see this headed. There is a path forward here. The United States and Canada could rebuild their trade relationship on more equitable terms, but it requires the U.S. to abandon the fantasy that they can dictate terms unilaterally. It requires acknowledging that Carney built real alternatives and that Canada doesn't need the U.S. the way Trump assumed they did. It requires actual negotiation, actual compromise, actual respect for Canada as a sovereign nation with its own interests. If Trump can manage that, if he can swallow his pride and approach this like an adult, there's still potential for a positive outcome. But based on everything we've seen so far, that seems unlikely, which means we're probably going to continue watching this slow-motion train wreck as U.S.-Canada relations deteriorate further and American economic interests suffer the consequences. Here's the ultimate lesson from all of this, and this applies way beyond just trade policy with Canada. Competence matters, strategy matters, understanding the actual dynamics of a situation matters. You can't just bluster and threaten your way through complex international relationships. Mark Carney demonstrated competence. He built a strategy, he understood the dynamics, and he executed. Warren Buffett recognizes that, which is why he's openly saying the U.S. is learning an expensive lesson. The question now is whether American leadership is capable of learning that lesson, or whether we're going to continue down this path of economic self-harm in pursuit of political theater. Based on everything we've seen, I'm not optimistic. But what I am certain of is this. Canada just proved that American economic dominance isn't inevitable. They proved that smart policy can create real alternatives. They proved that you don't have to accept being bullied by a larger neighbor. And that's a lesson that's going to echo far beyond North America. The world is watching and the world is learning. The expensive lesson Warren Buffett is talking about. It's going to be even more expensive than most people realize because the costs aren't just economic. They're strategic. They're about America's position in the world. And Mark Carney just changed that position fundamentally. We will continue to follow every development in this rapidly evolving story. For now, from all of us here, thank you for watching. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.